Nice to see everybody here. And I think it's always good in these talks to start off with a little silence and not together. And I usually prefer to have just true silence together, but I'd like us to, I'm going to do a little visualization today. And with our eyes closed, imagine the bag of bones that's sitting in the chair on the cushion is enclosed in the bag that's a different color from the one that you were looking at when you had your eyes open. And imagine how it would feel if you had your eyes open and looked on the screen and saw that every other person on that screen had a different color. They were all the same, but different from yours. How's that feel? How's it feel if everyone you see has the same color? What is your color? Thank you. I've never done that before with a group. Um, and I found it was powerful for me, just sort of imagining it that brief time. Um, Again, thank you for being here and giving me an opportunity to sort of share where I am on this and hopefully can provide some thoughts and perhaps provocations, difficulties or whatever that'll lead to a really rich discussion. I'm hoping that we can all get into this together as fellow travelers in this crazy world and see whether we can make some sense of it and help support ourselves and going forward. I also want to remind myself, but also each of you, that what I'm saying are all just a string of opinions. There's no truth here. It's just where I am at this moment and what I think's going on, and I offer that, and I hope it's helpful. Also, before I start, I want to explicitly acknowledge the horrendous events in DC 2 weeks ago. It's an example of what a riotous group can do, filled with joyful hatred. It's that same kind of group that used to lynch people in the South for racial terrorist purposes. It's that same kind of group that would lynch people for, frontier justice, get wound up and carried away, ensure that they're righteous and that nothing gets in their way. I think it's also an example, not I'm going to not expect, but I would think that many of you have already been exposed to this thought, but what we saw that day with the white supremacists clearly being demonstrated with Confederate flags and such, and the lack of police crackdown, was how different they were treated from anyone representing people of color in our recent history and really throughout history. And it made me realize that there's an old Roman dictum that's been carried through English common law and rests too through our founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin and others, speaking of how we would rather have 100 guilty people go free than to convict one innocent person. Well, that's upside down for people of color. It seems that in our system, putting 100 innocent people behind bars or punishing them is far more important, as long as you don't let any single one who is guilty of anything escape. Something that, I just, this is a realization that I only consciously acknowledged recently. And two, one more thought, just remembering that the three tenets is a critical way to practice in, I think, all parts of life. And I think that to the degree we can remember to bring the three tenets to this work, not knowing, bearing witness, taking action, I think that'll help us prevent getting burned out, and it'll help us be more effective, and it'll help us just live life more full and more connected with the oneness the three tenets helps us connect with. So what is your original race? I thought of this several months ago when I was getting deeper into the process of trying to dismantle my own white privilege or become more aware of it. And I thought that it was a great riff off the one of the classic koans of what's your original face before your parents were born. Think neither good nor evil. And, you know, these koans, there's not supposed to be an answer that's conceptual, and it helps us step outside of it. But I just have found myself, as I sit with this question of what is my original race, consciously brings me into trying to recognize that I have been unconsciously just living this knowing of being a white person, and not knowing what it is to not be a white person. And again, I only mentioned the koan not because this is going to be a koan exploration, because it's not. I am not a very good koan student, and I certainly would never be a good koan teacher. But I do find the bit of exposure I've had to be quite helpful. And so anyway, what is your original race? A year ago, some of you know, my primary focus was climate. And I was, you know, it's an existential risk. I still believe that to be the case, but it sat alone in my heart as the most important focus of my effort. But that's not the case for me now. Race, America's racial issues, and of course there's racial issues exist around the world. The Aborigines in Australia just come to mind as I look around the screen, but it's everywhere. But we've done an especially horrendous job in developing it and embedding it in our culture in the States. And I think it's important to remember all the races that we call races, all the separateness that we create through that. And I think for Americans, it's important for us to remember, particularly the Native Americans who were pushed out by the Euro-Americans as they came in and brought in the slaves after that. So we're all on different paths on this race question, and it's a very charged issue. And I want to just sort of lead into this by telling my own story as a white male, born into a middle-class Episcopal Republican home. To be clear, you'll see as I tell the story that I'm still very much a newbie in this question, in becoming an anti-racist. But I can tell you this newbie is very dedicated now, and I find that the rawness that I'm seeing in my heart from this has been very helpful to keep me mindful of how I need to walk through the world each day. So when I was raised by parents that never taught me anything racial, no racial prejudice. I was taught that being a racist was bad. You know, certainly that's not how we want to be. I wasn't taught to be prejudiced. I was raised in for those of you in America that know the old TV story series, Leave It to Beaver, very much a white bread suburb outside New York City. I spent summers at a camp in Virginia. As a young boy, I loved the history of the Civil War, was fascinated with that whole thing. I thought Robert E. Lee was quite a great general, and I held him in awe. I thought the Confederate flag was a cool representation of rebels, and as a young boy, for some reason, I identified with rebels, and of course, as teenagers, we all want to rebel. But I had no comprehension of what it was that it represented. And so I rolled through life knowing that race was an issue in the US, but that it was being caused by and happening to other people somewhere else. It wasn't about me. But as I grew older and I started to see the interdependence of life, the oneness of all, and I became involved with Zen peacemakers and the practice of bearing witness and doing bearing witness retreats at places like Auschwitz and Rwanda, Palestine. I found myself realizing that I don't have to leave the US to experience these places of great suffering, that it exists here in Native American lands with Native American people, and with, I've now come to see all people who aren't white, but I was, particularly understood early that it was about the slave and the Black experience that was such a raw, genocidal kind of thing that we needed to face here. So why do we need to go to Europe for that? But strangely, I still had an aversion to the terms of microaggression and macroaggression, white privilege and white supremacy. I knew racism was bad, and I knew we had treated Native Americans poorly, and that the Black history was horrendous, and the Blacks were still suffering. But I didn't understand those terms. They didn't affect me. They weren't about me. But I realized I needed to dig deeper. And as part of that work, I spent 5 days in Alabama visiting Selma and Montgomery and Birmingham in January, a year ago. The purpose of that visit with a couple of other practitioners was to see whether we could find a place to do an in-place bearing witness retreat around the Black experience, around slavery, around Jim Crow. And it was very moving, particularly the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is more colloquially called the Lynching Museum, where the names of over 4,000 racial lynching victims are listed in a most moving way. That was when at that place, I really came to feel that while things have changed, the face has changed, the core is still the same. We are still sitting with that same racist challenge. And then came May and the murder of George Floyd, or as I've heard people describe, and I think resonates well, is the horizontal lynching of George Floyd. And it was that triggered the many Black Lives Matters protests through the spring and summer. And while that was going on, I was really starting to understand I needed to dig deeper, that I needed to take my own arrow of awareness deeper into my soul, my conditioning. And I started to read and study, watch videos, listen to testimonies, read books, and try to get a better understanding of what it was to be in a Black body, what it was to not be white, not to be a white male. I mean, I started to realize through this lens as well that that being male is just an unconscious privilege that I was also denying. I didn't discriminate against women as far as I was concerned, and I don't think I do, but I'm still a participant in continuing this system. And so I understood, I don't know whether I've understood, I'm understanding a greater sense of what it is to have white male privilege. And I no longer felt it had nothing to do with me. I realized that I was part of this problem by being the way I was or being the way I wasn't, that I needed to dig into it. And so how do you do that? And it's funny, I think I read, and I agree with it, one of the greatest privileges that white people have is the privilege to forget about race. If you're white, you walk through the world and you don't think about it. But you don't have that privilege if you're not white. You never know when the race question isn't going to show up in your face. You never know when someone's going to throw a racial slur at you from their car as they drive by. You're having a nice day, and all of a sudden you're smacked upside the head with somebody just yelling out a racial slur. I don't have that problem. White people don't have that problem. So as I was digging deeper, I had always known of the horror of slavery. I mean, slavery sounds horrible, but as I spent more time reading testimonies, reading this, several of the stories of Frederick Douglass and many others, I started to feel it in my bones of what it might have been like to be a slave. And as I got into the horror of what Jim Crow was like, what the Reconstruction time was like, I was like, wow, I mean, it's just, you can read it, history, and have it in your head, but to try to bring it in your body just shifts things so much. There's a great book by Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning. And he tells it's a full history of centuries of slavery, and the question of color. And one of the things that softens a white American's perspective a little bit is to see that we didn't create slavery. Slavery has been going on for a long time before there were Euro-Americans anywhere near North or South America. So that's been going on, and but no country has done a better job of America than making it such a systemic problem, and creating the sense of inhumanness that in many cases, as the perspective was created by the Ivy League colleges of the US, so Princeton, Columbia, Dartmouth, the colleges and universities that we think of with the greatest respect were in many cases, well, all cases had slaves. In many cases were built by slaves, but in all cases had deep foundations of slave generated financial support. Slave owners like to send their kids to these colleges, and they would endow different theologians and different philosophers at those colleges. And those philosophers and those theologians would dig into the crazy histories that Ibram talks about in terms of the foundation of why dark people are in fact inferior, because they're the children of Ham from the Bible, and the whole exile story, and it's just anyway, I don't get it, but it gives people who want to spend time on the Bible justifying their racist views a way to do it. Same thing with philosophy. There were philosophers back in those days who could create these theories, and those were what were taught at these schools. So it was purposeful. And one of the things that's interesting too about this, the slaveholders is, and not surprising, they were petrified of all the slaves revolting because they didn't want to be enslaved. They wanted to be free. And they saw examples in the Caribbean where slaves had rebelled. Haiti, I think it was Haiti. I guess I should remember that. But there was examples where slaves had successfully rebelled, and the South was always afraid of that and needed to keep them under control. So that's history, and I think a lot of people thought that the arc of our racial history was completed with the election of President Obama. We had slavery, we had the Civil War, we had Reconstruction, we had Jim Crow, we had the Great Migration, and we ended up with a black man in the White House. We ended up with a black president. would seem like things have changed. It would seem like the arc of our racial history had changed, but it hasn't, as we know. There's clearly much, much more work to do. While there's no more slavery, no more lynchings, no more legalized segregation, but the operating system is still embedded. Discrimination still exists socially, economically, educationally. As I said earlier, people of color are usually presumed guilty, much more so than white folks. They have to deal with micro and macro aggressions every day. There's systemic poverty, limited opportunity, barriers to voting, disparities in health outcomes and environmental conditions. And of course, what's really drawn this to our attention most recently is the more frequent deadly encounters with law enforcement and the imbalance in the justice system, the discriminatory justice system. So there's a Black historian by the name of Eddie Glaub at Princeton who makes a very good point, I think. He says, and let's not be confused. Trump is not the cause. He just tapped into who we really are. And I think that's important to remember. This reality that he tapped into was just below the surface all along. It hasn't gone away, and we still need to address it. It's deeply, deeply within us. I'm reminded of a great quote that I first saw in Van Jones' book, Beyond the Messy Truth, which is a wonderful book, a hopeful book in a way. He's really an amazing guy. America is a dream founded on a nightmare. And it's each generation's responsibility and opportunity to bring us closer to the dream. Resmaa Menakem is a great author, written a couple of books. One I recommend is called My Grandmother's Hands. And the title refers to the fact that when he was a little boy and sitting comfortably in his grandma's lap, he noticed her hands were thick and big, much bigger than his mother's hands, or the hands that, he just noticed them. And how innocent little kids are. Well, Grandma, why are your hands so big? And she ended up telling him it's because she picked cotton for whatever it was, 30 or 40 years. And picking cotton is a brutal job, backbreaking job, but it requires you to stick your hands through these briars all day long, and your hands are getting ripped up. And so her hands were very thick. It's a sweet story through the eyes of a grandson about what Grandma lived through as a cotton picker and what it was like in her era. He also wrote a great book called Healing Racialized Trauma. So in there, he points out that it's taught that race is a species, different races are different species, and that dark people are more like apes than they are like humans. The white body is the standard human. All others are deviant. And he speaks of the intergenerational trauma that carries through the non-white bodies. And when you think back, when I certainly think back and review that history and really try to imagine, embody what it might have been like to be there as a not white person, it's no wonder, as he points out, and many other Black authors and Black friends might tell you, if you're really close, that they don't trust white bodies. If they don't know, it takes a long time to come to trust a white body, because the white body represents all that traumatic history. And everyone, all races in our country, suffer from that intergenerational trauma and karma. So I want to go back to the arc of history, back to slavery. In 1860, one half of the population, as I think I mentioned, 4 million people were slaves. Those 4 million people were owned by well less than 1% of the wealthiest people in the South. And those wealthy people in the South had this fear of these slavery uprisings, and it served their purpose to beat into everybody's mind that slaves are nothing more, maybe not even quite as important as good as cattle or pigs, They were chattel. They were property, and they were not to be respected as anything close to human. That allowed them to make the poor white folks feel better because they had someone to look down on. So it helped them control the poor white folks. And it also gave them freedom to treat their slaves any way they wanted to. And slavery existed in Washington, D.C. until 1862. So in the nation's capital, we still had slavery. And even free blacks in D.C., but throughout the South, of course, as well, they might have been free. They may not have been slaves. There weren't many, but there were maybe tens of thousands of free blacks. They weren't really free. They weren't slaves. So in that sense, they were free, but they had to operate under black codes. So there were a lot of things they were not allowed to do, and there were things they had to do that white people didn't have to consider. Families were split. Rape was common. Beatings, hunger. So there was no safety or security, and of course, no freedom. Then the Civil War came. The Civil War, for those of you who don't know, more Americans died in the Civil War than all the other wars that America's ever fought in. That's a hell of a trauma to carry throughout a nation's history. More died there than all the other wars we've been in combined. Followed by Reconstruction, which was not a long period, 12 years, 65 to 77, but it was a painful, horrendously disruptive world for the South. Initially, Republican governments in the South, state governments came in, and voting for blacks was opened up and allowed. In some cases, that voting had to be ensured by Union troops sent down, Army troops posted around state houses and around polling stations so that the voting could be safe. And this was when the Ku Klux Klan started to arise. And the Democrats, who were very much racist and segregationists, were fighting the Republicans, some of which were from the North, but there were Republicans in the South that were very much against racism and slavery. But the old slaveholders did a good job of managing to whip up the poor white folks into supporting, attacking through racial terror, the black people that were then free, and to subject them to all kinds of challenges and threats and fears. Supportive, sympathetic whites were getting lynched along with blacks, being tortured, being burned to death. It was important for the segregationists to get back control of the state house, each of the state houses in the South, and they did it through terror, far beyond what we saw in D.C. on the 6th of January. And over the course of those 12 years, and after Grant left and his administration and Johnson came in, the North was tired of the expense of continuing to send troops down there, and Johnson wanted to have some votes support from the South, so he ended up pulling the troops back. And it was within a matter of years, maybe even months, when it just came crushing down on blacks. Voting became impossible again. If you voted, you were at risk of just being killed on your way back from the polling booth, or being killed on your way to it, trying to get there. Just a crushing time. And the Klan, which arose then, was very efficient at terrorism. And as the South became dominated by segregationists again, Jim Crow came into existence. Jim Crow is a term, I can't remember exactly where it came from, doesn't matter, but it's a term about the kinds of laws that were passed in the South, separate but equal. So it was a way to justify and legalize segregation. And it was a horrible time, because separate but equal was shown in the end to be separate for sure, and very, very much unequal. The area of towns where blacks were allowed to live didn't have paving on the streets or the sidewalks. The schools, if there were schools for black children who were not allowed to go to the white schools, they were well underfunded and overcrowded. No heat in the winter, just no supplies. And it was just a purposeful way to prevent them from ever stepping outside of their controlled existence within the society. And the Klan, I originally, I'm based in Colorado. I'm not there right now, but I was stunned to find out several months ago that in Colorado, and I think many of you may think of Colorado, which is in the Rocky Mountains, as a place where racism wouldn't be a problem. In the 1920s, the middle 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan controlled the state government. They controlled the government of Denver. The Denver chief of police, Klan member. The Denver mayor, Klan member. The governor of the state, Klan member. The majority of the houses of, the House and the Senate, Klan members. The majority were Klan members. And that lasted for 3 or 4 years before people started voting them out. But the Klan was deeply involved. And there were lynchings in Colorado as well. It was back in the 1900s. So Jim Crow didn't start to change until 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education, with changing, the separate but equal doesn't work, and that was the Supreme Court. Interesting to step back earlier in the century, President Wilson, Democrat, and I think a lot of people might think of him as a wise guy. Used to be wise, not a wise guy like a mafia member, but an intellectual and a philosopher, and had been the president of Princeton, was an avid racist. And while he was president, he segregated the federal workforce. It's crazy. So the Great Migration followed Jim Crow, or came out of Jim Crow, and that was 1910 to 1970, where over 5 million blacks from the Southeast moved north or west to leave their conditions there, seeking better opportunities in the North and West. And what they found were better opportunities for sure, but they were still deplorable. They were still segregated. They still, in Chicago and Detroit and New York, they were expected to stay in their own neighborhoods. And when they stepped out, they were at risk of having a cross burned on their lawn, or they were at risk of having their house firebombed in Chicago, in Detroit. So it's not just the South that carries this problem. So I want to sit back to lynching a bit. Originally, lynching was, I think I mentioned, frontier justice. And originally, the preponderance of the folks that were lynched were white males who were suspects in actual crimes, cattle thievery, murder. And it was usually in towns that weren't well developed and didn't have a good judicial system. They weren't always guilty. They certainly weren't always innocent either, but it was primarily frontier justice, as it was called. But as the racial terror efforts of the Klan and trying to maintain the segregation of the South grew, blacks exceeded whites lynching victims in 1886. And black victims peaked at 161 in 1 year. That was in 1892. And black victims were still being lynched at a rate of more than 2 a week in 1901. And in 1919, after the Civil War, there were more than 1.5 lynchings a week. And in many cases, those lynching victims were World War I veterans who had the audacity to wear their uniforms in public and act like they were proud of being a veteran. For that alone, they were attacked and lynched, and sometimes one sergeant coming back from the ship that brought him from Europe on his way through the South on a bus was told he couldn't use the bathroom or something when the bus stopped somewhere, and he wasn't happy about that. And at the next bus stop, the sheriff pulled him off and blinded him with his billy club in both eyes. Nothing ever happened to the sheriff. And that's what, that's how veterans were treated. And this is after serving in World War I. And I think it's, in terms of recognizing the trauma that resides in our collective being, these lynchings, these racial terrorized lynchings, were in many cases set up to be spectator opportunities. There were postcards made of the victims. The Postmaster General finally instituted a rule that said, we're not going to put those postcards in the post anymore. So people, when they were sharing their souvenirs with their friends, had to put them in envelopes. But and to look at these pictures of these happy white folks standing around a lynching victim with young girls and boys, big smiles on their faces with their parents, it's chilling. And I understand that in many cases, the honor, if you will, of getting the rope up over the limb was given to a special young boy who could climb up the tree and have a proud moment. So there were plenty of white people who were disgusted with this. It's not that all white people were bad, but it was allowed to happen. And it was only last year in 2020 that we finally passed a federal anti-lynching bill. Just last year. And it's no point going through the excuses. It didn't happen until last year. So I'm going through numbers, and they're just numbers. And so how do we embody this? How do we face it fully? One way is to do what we were trying to do in January, to set up physical visits at places like Selma and Montgomery, New Orleans slave market, places where someone might have been lynched near your home, where you can visit, any place where we can go and sit with that racial history and sit in silence with the energy that's in that field and feel that in our bodies. But we can't do that now. We have COVID and it's not safe. But we can immerse ourselves in written testimonies and in the verbal testimonies and the visual testimonies. And I recommend Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns, where she writes beautifully of the experiences of Jim Crow and the Great Migration, and how that was for the people that lived that. And it's enlightening, and she does a good job of putting you there. She also wrote a really wonderful book called Caste, which you probably have all heard of. It's on the bestseller list. I recommend it highly. She reframes this narrative that we're all wrestling with and puts it in a way that explains it, I think, better by drawing parallels to the Indian, as in Asian Indian caste system. And she posits the thought of this has created for us an operating system. And I'd never really thought of it that way, but the operating system that your computer, and we're looking at each other on right now, is the constraints of how all the software we have operates. And if we think of this racism problem, this white supremacy problem that we have as an operating system, and understand that our political system software, our economic software, our financial software, our educational software, social software, all operate within that, and we don't see it. It's like that movie, The Matrix. If you don't know what you're in the middle of, and that's how we walk through life, unless we purposefully decide that's not how we want to walk through life, and that we want to no longer accept the fact that white people are on the top and black people on the bottom and everyone else sort of spreads out in the middle. We're all human. We're all just a bag of bones with a random color on the outside. Another powerful book, short book, called Coming of Age in Mississippi, written by Ann Moody. She writes of her experience as a teenage girl in the 1960s in Mississippi. Extraordinarily powerful, brutal. It's just, it allows you, gives you a window on understanding how that terror really shows up and how effective it was. And the operating system that Wilkerson speaks of is very embedded. You know, racism and white supremacy are really, really devious. They're adaptable. They're truly entrenched. It's a challenge. So I would recommend doing that. It's been effective and helpful for me to take my own level of awareness deeper. I have a lot more work to do. I'm not confused because I see how I feel about things and notice about myself differences from what I thought I was seeing just a month ago and 3 and 4 months ago. It's a constant battle. It's a constant battle. So what do you do? I think I'd come back to the 3 tenets. And it's funny, when I was thinking about this, I'll have something to say about bearing witness and taking action, but the first of the 3 tenets is not knowing. And in this case, it's almost like not knowing's inside out, because our benign ignorance, I'm not sure that's a knowing, but maybe it is. I'm just not, I don't know about this not knowing about this issue. So I'm just going to leave it at that. It's it's something to sit with, though. I'm finding it's sort of a koan on its own. But bear witness to yourself, bear witness to your own feelings and emotions and all around you. How does it feel to listen to what I'm saying? And how's it going to feel as we go through our discussion later on? How do you feel about the question you might want to ask? And don't turn away from that. Face it and acknowledge, as I have, trying to, that this white supremacy, this racist thing, this white privilege is in our culture, it's our society, it's our politics, it's schools, it's communications, it's communities, families, it's in ourselves, it's in each of us. So stay with it, particularly when it's uncomfortable. Feel your body. And let that awareness seep deeply into your bones. Reshma Menachem calls it somatic abolition work. I sort of like that term, somatic abolition work. So taking action, the things I have found helpful and they're easy, I suggest things like just imagine, like we did in our little brief sitting, imagine waking up tomorrow morning in a body of color, darker than your own. What's that like? What's it like to look at the world through the eyes in a black body or a brown body? What's it like to walk down the street and have someone yell a racial slur at you, or follow you around the store with the security concern you're going to steal something? Or you're sitting at a traffic light, just waiting there, listening to some music, and all of a sudden a police car pulls up beside you. If you're not white, maybe that doesn't feel so good. You'd be on an alert. What could happen? I don't think about it unless I've been speeding, in which case I do think about it. But if you're not white, how's that feel? Or stepping outside and seeing someone put a pile of poop on your front step or in your mailbox. Or being looked at in a non-welcoming way as you walk into a cafe. Or more passively, being asked by someone who thinks of themselves as an ally. So tell me, what's it like being black? It's, there's a whole lot of things we got to pay attention to. talk to other white people. As a white person, if you're a white person, talk to other white people about this. Ask them how this issue is showing up for them, and find an opening that makes sense, an opening that, a upaya that allows for the conversation to be safe, if I might say it that way, for them, so that it can be explored in a way that helps them see what they're not seeing. Own it every day. Become a dedicated anti-racist. That's a term I didn't understand before I really started digging deeper here either. I always thought of myself as being against racism, and I knew racism was bad. And this anti-racism, I think, what's that? Well, anti-racism, I think, is what I'm trying to do, is try to embody the recognition that we need to actually consciously move forward in deconstructing this operating system. If you have privilege, what privilege you have, use it to dismantle the system. Affirm, liberate, and empower people of color. And don't ask people of color to help you with this process unless they've offered. The last thing a person of color needs when they're walking through the day, enjoying whatever it is they're enjoying, is to have some white person stick their face in front of them and say, oh, so tell me what it's like to be black, or help me understand how I'm being white makes you feel black, or whatever stupid question I've heard people ask. And all of a sudden, that question of race isn't something they can forget about and just be a person walking through a beautiful day. Now they have to confront this issue that they're not the standard, as Menachem would say. And I think it's important to remember, we're not bad people because of the operating system that we inherited. And while you may feel shame and guilt, and that's okay, but you don't need to. And there's sadness, there's all kinds of things one might feel. But it's really more about what you do about it from now on. What can you do to deconstruct this in your own way? As Bernie would say in instructions to the cook, what are the ingredients that you have? Who do you know? What are your resources? How do you want to apply them? And don't forget, this issue is alive for folks that aren't white every day, all day. And just keep bearing witness to your feelings. I love the quote from, again, Eddie Glaub from Princeton. Set them free from being white. And I think there's a lot of white people that wouldn't understand that. But if you think about it, if we can be free from being white, then we can be free from being other, and we can starting to see all of humanity as being our fellow humans. And in most cases, I think we may be all Zen students. We all know who Dogen is. And Dogen's great quote, to study the self is to forget the self. And I've sat with this a bit, and I found myself thinking, as a white person, I can study myself with the only challenge to myself is myself, right? That's what I have to deal with, my own self delusions. But if I weren't white, I'd also have to worry about physically being threatened by folks as well. It's not just my own self. I have to worry about other selves attacking me. Maybe that doesn't make any sense. But it's something I'm wrestling with. So Menachem says it's going to take 9 generations to make a change. I certainly agree. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And I don't know whether 9 generations is long enough, but it certainly is it's a North Star to keep moving forward, as Van Jones says, to do what we can to advance the effort. But what is your original color? Does it separate you from God, from universal oneness, from all others? I want to end with 2 quotes from Martin Luther King. Nobody's free until everybody's free. And the arc of the moral universe is long, but bends towards justice. The question I'm asking myself is, what can I do to help accelerate that? Thank you. So questions, happy to take.
Thank you, Grant. And we
Wow,
have,
I talked a long time. I apologize for that. I didn't realize you're gonna. I was shooting for 30 minutes. I'm sorry, I missed.
well, it was a beautiful and perfect miss. So thank you for that. Uh, a couple of things here. Grant referred to a number of books, and Hoden has been putting those up into the chat, links to some of those. For the plunge into race that we're doing later in February, we did put together a suggested reading list. It's longer. I think there are maybe 15 or 20 titles on that list, and it is posted on the website. And Hoden might be able to link to it while we're talking here. But you can find all of the titles I think that Grant referred to, plus a number of others that are contemporary, as well as earlier writing, like James Baldwin and some of the others that go back. Oh, yeah. Yoshin's saying not on the website, but on the Hive. But if everybody's a member, you'll be able to get down into the event in the Hive. So we've got Grant has kindly given us 90 minutes today, I believe. Grant.
Yeah, sure. And I don't feel obligated to stay if you don't want to. And I don't have a hard stop either. So I'm looking forward to this part as the juicy part and where I'm going to get a chance to learn. So yeah, I'm here. And again, I apologize for going so long, man. Sorry about that.
Please don't. Please don't. It was rich. It was very rich. So everyone, please relax and let's be in community here. And if you've got a comment or a question, you want to ask Grant to sharpen something that he said, or feedback about something that he said, and I can see everybody. So if you want to do it old school and just wave your hand, we don't have to do the electronic thing. Tetsuji, I see your hand waving there from across town. Go ahead.
Yes,
There you go.
thank you, Grant. That was a very heartfelt and affecting presentation. I have, however, I would suggest if we're going to deal with racism today in the United States, a different strategy. First, I would stop talking about the past. It's there, and I'm not in any way suggesting that everything that Grant said and all the books that describe the horrors of the past and how the United States was built on slavery, I just don't think it works today to use guilt as a way in which to achieve what we want to achieve, which is a society in which we deal with white supremacy. What guilt does, or trying to make people feel guilty, is it makes them react exactly in the opposite way. They become defensive. They try to defend them. They don't deal with the issue of today. I think we need to deal with what's happening today, not what happened in the past, and that the use of guilt just isn't very effective. I thought the 1619 project was wonderful. Then we have the 1776 project. Now we can argue, which is ridiculous. We can argue about those two, but that's not what we should be dealing with. We should be dealing with how do we deal with racism today, at one point. Second point is we need to do, other than to shame the white supremacists. These people have deep feelings and deep concerns and fears. They're unfounded. I don't excuse them, but they believe them and they understand them for some reason. And we need to understand and figure out how we help them deal with their antipathy and their white supremacy issue. And thirdly, it is, and I suppose in this way I do agree with what Grant was saying, is deal with how we ourselves deal with race. I mean, the books that I found most effective, is in addition to the books that Grant mentioned, but I think Claudine Rankine's books, and particularly the most recent one, Just Us, is very effective because it deals with, she discusses being a Black woman today and her experiences and experiences of others, and appreciating that and understanding that. And she does it in a sophisticated way. She does bring in history, but and what I found in reading that is, as a person who has been very concerned about racism for many years, I saw many aspects of racism within me that I hadn't appreciated until I read Claudine's particularly her most recent book. The other books are wonderful as well, but that it saw that. So understanding that within me of how my mind or how my experience or my culture affects my relationship and understanding of racism. And I mean, one phrase particularly I thought was particularly wonderful when she said, she took to issue someone who said, well, you know, I'm race neutral, I don't see race. Well, I've always thought that's what we want to be. But her point is, no, you do need to see race. You do need to understand it. A very complex issue. So those are my thoughts. Again, which is not in any way to say that this is an extraordinary and important project, but I just don't think dealing with guilt works. I think we need to understand why people are racist today and the underlying issues of whiteness, rather than blaming them. And we need to look within ourselves and figure out how to deal with these issues.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with everything you've said, everything. And I'll go in reverse order. I think it's absolutely right that for me, when I'm exploring something or when I'm trying to learn, I follow my heart, and I get called by different reasons to go read different books or see different things or talk to different people. So I'm not suggesting in any way that the books I throw out there are what anyone should read, or not. I mean, what you just recommended, the Rankins, I think, well regarded. I haven't read those books, but what she speaks of, I have read about and have heard from Black people, and I've come to understand that deeply within myself too. I now realize, I mean, you know, that that great expression, I'm colorblind. Bullshit. Nobody's colorblind. It's like, you're gonna, how can you be colorblind? How can you say when you walk down the street you don't notice there's an attractive man or attractive woman or a fat man or a fat woman or I mean, people are, it's like, whatever. So you're absolutely right on that. I think it's important for us to see our own ownership of this and see our own racism that sits in us. And I continue to peel back more layers and go, oh, wow, I didn't see that one. Your second point, absolutely. I don't mean to suggest in any way that we should be doing anything other than approaching the white supremacists with the three tenets as well. Try to understand why they are where they are. Try to understand how to connect with them, and to find a common ground. I mean, I'm an advocate of that in all areas of life. So I don't. I don't want to say a double negative. I agree with you 100% that we need to work on that. And as practitioners, that's a critical part of it. What I will say though, and I know this from a lot of my right of center friends who are very concerned about racism, very concerned about the climate. I mean, they're, you know, good guys, if you will. Even they say that some of these people you can't talk to. I mean, their own relatives, that they're lost in this delusion bubble so deeply that it's very difficult to connect with them. That doesn't mean you're not supposed to try though. And then there, you know, yes. So yes on two. On one, you're absolutely right there too. There's no benefit to shame or guilt. And I hope and of course the shame and guilt thing comes into the white fragility, which is a term I hate, but I've given this talk before and I've had people say, well, I'm feeling a little whatever. And I go, well, I'm sorry about that, but let's think about it. There's nothing compared to what it's like to be living in a not white body right now. You got a little white fragility, get over it. I don't feel any guilt. I don't feel any shame. I didn't do it. I didn't create this system. But what I find is helpful for me in going over deeply this history is it helps me embody what it might be like to not be white. It helps me understand, like I didn't before, the term microaggression. I remember hearing microaggression whenever that first time, 3 years, 4 years ago. I'm going, microaggression, really? It's a micro, get over it, was my reaction. But what I now understand is that little look that you get when you walk into a cafe that's like, you're not welcome, that you noticed the people before didn't get, but it may be true, may not be true, but you're getting because of your color, resonates in the historical intergenerational trauma that you carry in your body, and it brings up that pain. I understand that now. I mean, I think I understand it. I can't know that. But so for me, I find digging deeply into this horrendous history helps me embody what it might be like not to be white. So I don't want to build anyone's shame or guilt. There's no benefit there. And there's certainly no way to your second point, that's no way to start a conversation with someone who is an avowed white supremacist or, whatever, by trying to do that just shuts the conversation down and ensures them that you're a waste of time. So very good points. Thank you.
Thanks, Techazi. Great contribution, and thanks for your responses, Grant. Please, anyone else? Sandy, hi, welcome. Glad you made it.
Hi, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, sorry for my late arrival. Thanks very much. I wanted to reference a study, but I can't, I'm sorry, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it was provided through or for those individuals who may work with children, birth to age 6. And this study was done, it's about implicit bias. And so the study revealed that not only do Black boys get judged differently, but they also get judged by Black educators differently. So they get into trouble more just because of their color, because of the color of their skin. And this is really interesting. And so going through that, and I, as a biracial person, my mother is Black. So let me see, it goes back 4 or 5 generations. My great grandparents, he was a Black African man, and she was an indigenous Mohawk woman. And so from that point forward, my great grandfather, Black man, married a white woman, Canadian, and captured, taken to the States, sold as a slave. And so managed to escape and come back to Canada through the Underground Railroad, landed in Toronto, and then was given some land in Owen Sound. And so he made his way to Owen Sound. His name is John Hall, and right now there's a producer who's working on a documentary about influential Black Canadians who helped to settle communities. Just because a lot of people don't realize that there are so many things that they need to celebrate and be grateful for the Black individuals who perpetuated the community that they live in. And so from every generation forward, there's mixed race. Black person, white person. And so I've grown up, my childhood was really surrounded mostly by Black people. It wasn't until my family moved to another community and we were visibly, there was one other woman in the community who was Black. She ran a nursing home, so she had status within the community. And my parents owned a clothing store. And, but it was interesting because even though my skin color, it would not lead anyone to believe that I have any Black, I have my race is anything other than white. My hair certainly would draw attention, and people would, at their own will reach out to touch my hair, to make claims that, oh, it's softer than what I thought it would be, to question whether or not I can actually be in the sun, if I'm more protected in the sun because of my Black skin heritage. And so just so many things like that. And what I've realized is that, so I took a look, I went in to do to take a look at my own implicit bias, and being raised in a mixed race household, but surrounded mostly with Black people, I have many biases that were revealed through that. So I think every human being has an opportunity to learn about something that they have been raised with, or something that society has influenced them with. And with my circle of friends, what I've realized is that one of my closest friends, she was raised having with Black help. So someone who would help take care of the children, someone who would help cook in the house. And even though they were not called slaves, there's this perception of them being different, and different as in their status. And so I'm just noticing more, every generation. And when we talk about it takes 9 generations, that's the story of our indigenous people too, with the big scoop of taking the children from their homes. And it takes many generations, the trauma that is experienced. And we cannot overlook the power of the adult caregivers and how they influence the children. Hatred that is present in 2-year-olds, only because of how the indoctrination is in their home towards people who have a different appearance in their skin tone or their texture of their hair, the way that their hair flows, things like that. So there's so many things. And as a person who is passing as a white person, I have an opportunity to be around people who think that they're safe to tell their jokes. And so as I nip it in the bud and I stop them in their tracks, that's the only thing that I can do, is bring awareness to the fact that just because it appears as though I have the same color as you does not necessarily mean that I have the same opinion as you. So many different things I could contribute, but that's my little bit for now.
Well, thank you for sharing. Just all I can say is thank you.
Hi, Mark. Good to see you. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
So I think a big issue is that the term racism or racist covers a multitude of behaviors and attitudes. And while we certainly still have the extreme white supremacists that we've seen so much in the last year, and especially in the last month, who would be thrilled to have segregation back and probably would be capable of lynching and all manner of things. There's also a lot of other people. I live, as I've mentioned to Jeff many times, I live in the Richmond, Virginia area, but I'm out in the country. And there's a heck of a lot of Confederate flags out here. But I think most of my neighbors wouldn't fall into that real white supremacist category. And the truth is, they consider themselves to be very liberal. They don't think of themselves as racist at all. And if you even try to engage them in a conversation about it, they get very defensive. And there's an organization that I've been somewhat active with, my wife and I here, called Coming to the Table, which has the mission of bringing African Americans and white people together to just talk to each other in a non-confrontational manner. What happens, though, is that at most of these meetings, it's African Americans and white liberals who show up. And I've made a few attempts to get some of my neighbors to come. And it's very difficult because they just believe they're going to be, attacked if they come. So starting the conversation is really hard.
No, you're right. And that's why I was saying it's important. And I think it's very important for, if I might suggest, for you to engage those neighbors around the table, just the white folks. And just say, you know what, if they're friends, and say, I want to get an understanding of your view of this. I mean, however the safe entry is, so that they don't feel like they have to defend it, one white person to another person. Do we have an issue? I mean, and how do we address this? And it's interesting. I said what I said about the DC riot on the 6th of January. But I am sure there are a number of people there. There were some Black people there. There are a number of people there who have no interest in hating Black people. They were just upset with the country. Tea Party people weren't necessarily all white.
Yep.
They weren't all segregationists. They weren't all hardcore white supremacists. And you are right. I'm in another group working on a business process, and there's actually 4 Black guys and me. And one of them said, we got to really figure out what is racism. What is race? And I was like, yeah, I mean, to your point. So it covers a lot of things. So I don't know, but I did resonate with your Richmond comment. I actually lived and worked in Richmond for a year and a half. And, in case anyone hasn't noticed, the name Grant ain't the best name to be walking around in Richmond with. And I remember I went through interviews and, I met the chairman and the executive committees, whatever. And at one point I'm getting in the elevator to go up to the big floor, and the chairman was in the elevator by himself as I walk in, and he sticks his hand out to shake my hand to say hello. He says, "Oh, hi, Grant. Changed your name yet?" It's like, yeah. So I know those Confederate flags, but what I know too, though, is those Confederate flags are being flown by the same people like me that would have flown it 40 years ago because it was kind of cool. It's part of the Southern heritage. Not seeing that rich, horrendous history has to be recognized as part of that flag. So, it's back to the earlier point about how we don't want to shame and guilt people. Well, for sure, I didn't create this system. So maybe I'm denying it, but I don't feel shame and guilt other than what I'm not, if I don't own it and start trying to do something about it now. So I would have, I actually had Confederate flags, and but now, and I'm so glad we're changing the name of the different military installations, and so it's not after Bragg and the other great generals on the traitor side. So it's good points, but I rub bodies with other white people, give them a hug, find out what
it's just a matter of developing language, which I'm working on doing, but it's very difficult. It sounds easy to say, oh, we'll just ask them questions and draw them out. But having the right words and the right techniques to not make them wary is what I lack.
Yeah. Well, it's just about listening, and it's difficult. I have a relative who said recently, the most persecuted group in America are white men because everyone else is getting all these advantages. And he truly believes that. Back to the earlier point. I mean, these people have their views. And I said to my answer to him, or question, really, another question. I said, really? Have you ever thought about what it might be like to wake up Black tomorrow? And he said, that's not fair. I said, that's the point.
Thanks, Mark. And Roshi, I'm going to just insert a comment here, and then we'll go to you. As people come up against your time limits, be sure to check back. We're recording this, so if you want to revisit this great conversation and Grant's great presentation, it will be up on the website. It'll be a week or two probably, but it'll eventually be up there too. And also, if you're interested in any of these resources, do take a look at the chat and copy any of those links. Hoden has been dutifully putting up links for information for you all.
Mioshin, maybe you have everyone's email. You could send out just a follow-up email with the links to the books that have others have discussed as well.
That's a good idea.
Just one list rather than trying to get people to copy the chat stuff.
Good. Shishin Roshi, please go ahead and unmute yourself, and there you go.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to say a few things. Well, one about history is that one of the most important things about the Holocaust is survivors say, don't let us ever forget, about it. And I know that in Germany, it's against the law to display any Nazi symbols or to promote any Nazi propaganda. I mean, and it's a serious crime. I think you can get years in jail for doing that. And in our country, we glorify the traitors from the South. I know that there's statues of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and the Confederate flag. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, the University of Mississippi is called the Rebels. I don't know if they've changed their name, but we glorify it instead of making it criminal, to promote these things. And I'm wondering, I think it was mentioned in the book Cast, I'm wondering if that's something that would have any effect, to let people know that these are traitors. This is sedition and treason. And another thing I wanted to mention was that Kendi, talking about white supremacists, he doesn't, if I remember correctly, I read one of his articles that he didn't say that they were racist as such. They were just promoting their own self-interest. And I think that's a way to engage white supremacists, from that point of view is, what is their interest here? What's their self-interest here? In order, you can look, of course, at slave owners. They had a big self-interest in maintaining it, and you just look at most everybody functions from their own self-interest. And it's something we talk about a lot at our Zen Center. What does it mean to have self-interest? But I think that's a perspective. And I want to say one more thing too, that I have been in situations where I've been the only white person there at the very beginning when and I think it's important to try to get these things viscerally. When I was a graduate student at Berkeley, I could only afford to live in Oakland, and the only white people in the neighborhood were myself and 3 other students who lived in the house that I lived in. And our next door neighbors, we were friendly with them. They'd invite us over to parties, to wakes and things like that. And we had a very good relationship. There wasn't any tension, but in a different experience. I've never been to Africa, but I would like to experience that too. But anyway, that's enough.
Yeah, visiting Africa and Rwanda was a trip. And the statues question is one that's, the military ones are bad enough. But as you walk up the big stairs going to the capital, state capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, the prominent statue on the right as you approach the rotunda to go into the capitol, after you walk up these big stairs, is the father of gynecology, who operated on borrowed women slaves from slaveholders, and at expense to himself paid for their upkeeping, and operated on them hundreds of times without painkillers to discover the best way to deal with gynecological problems. And his statue, this brutal, he's like a Mengele almost. He wasn't torturing people on purpose, but he's like a Mengele. And there's his statue on the right as you walk in to the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama. Thank you, Shishin. Irvin, you had a question, I think.
Yeah, not a question, but 3 days ago on the 26th in Australia, we all had a public holiday for Australia Day. And so that's celebrating white colonisation of a country where the indigenous people have been here for 60,000 years. And there's a growing movement now, and it's called Invasion Day, and there's been a lot of protests. But I still think we're a long way from being able to have an Australia Day which incorporates the indigenous people and the white people without celebrating what was white invasion. So Australia has a lot of problems as well.
Yeah, I used to work and had reason to visit Australia a number of times. A wonderful country, but it does have its own perspective. The Aborigine genocide almost. Yeah, and same issue with the kids being shipped off to school and that we did here. Yeah, it's America's not alone, sadly.
Thanks, Mervyn. We have about 5 more minutes. If Kevin, hi from Canada. Kevin, go ahead and unmute yourself. Oops.
Greetings to everyone. Grant, thank you very much. With your permission, Jeff, I'd like to share a story that I shared with Jeff. I'm a former priest and pastor and worked for 13 years in the prison system and saw inhumanity at its finest, and watched murders, racial murders. I currently work in Eastern Europe and Russia, working with orphans and the disenfranchised and the sex slave trade underground. We rescue young girls, gypsy girls that have been stolen right from church and synagogue backyards, and we try to bring them back home. But we do so many other things. Not long ago, 5 years ago, I was in a refugee camp in Hungary, a Syrian refugee camp, which was, I'd like to say, an underground refugee camp, which housed the violent individuals that came from other camps, and they were there with their families. And although it wasn't necessarily a racial thing, when we incarnate, I like that word, incarnate ourselves. Being a Canadian, I can't incarnate myself into the US experience. Although I did work for a year and a half in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly shove, and I did experience what it meant, a little bit of racism. But in the Hungarian sense, I was in a refugee camp at 11 o'clock at night feeding, and most of them were Islamic, how can I say this without being a racist, given to violence. It was religious-based violence. And I was there with a number of Hungarians who happened to be secret police, which I didn't know. And we were feeding them bread because they had to supply their own food. So it was a humanitarian effort. And it was my turn to hand out like Quiznos submarine sandwiches, two lines that formed on both sides. And in that situation, I wasn't briefed as to the hierarchy of skin color and as to, how could I say this, as to clerical, if you were an Islamic imam, you were to get the food first. The people on the other side, there were different brands of Islam, shall I say, and just ordinary people. Well, I just innocently went to hand bread to the man on my left. And I saw my partner in the work, his eyes go very big, and he lunged at me. And this all happened in a millisecond. And the man on my right, who should have been fed first because of his stature in the community, the white man in the community, let's say, he had a shiv, a big knife he pulled out of his robe, and he was reaching in front of me. Sorry, to stab the man next to me because he was offended. And in a moment, all I could do was kind of block myself. And I guess because of some of the training they give you in the prison, how to grab wrists, I grabbed his wrist a little forceful, and the knife thrust into his throat. And he expired. And when I felt that my life was given to giving life, not taking life. But when we see racism in any form, shape, color, creed, philosophy, I think we're called as peacemakers to what a pastor friend of mine said, to dirty ministry, where we put ourselves in the front lines, And Grant, God bless you. I just think your thoughts are right on the money. And I guess that's all I could say is to be incarnate. I want to be incarnate into the life of Americans and what they're feeling. We have our own racism here towards our First Peoples, but thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. And there's more about Kevin's story that'll be in our newsletter later on today if you want to watch for that. We are at the bottom of the hour, and unless there's another brief comment or question, I don't want to keep people longer than we promised, or we can wrap up. Okay, let's do. So Grant, once again, thank you very much. This was really rich.
Jane had a hand.
I'm sorry, I didn't see who did.
Jane.
Oh, hi, Jane. If you have a short one, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I hesitate in bringing this up, but I thought it would be useful. It feels like this event is geared toward white people. And I'm not saying that was the intention, but it's how I feel. And it brings up a lot of pain for me because growing up, I always felt kind of invisible, like I was supposed to blend into, you know, the white community around me. And it's hard to say this because I would often just not say anything. And I kind of wondered if this would be a talk of that nature, and if I would feel, you know, like I was being talked to, or, you know, that I was being, that I was the right audience member. And so, and that's the question I have about the Bearing Witness retreat next month. Like, who is the target audience, and will it you know, be too triggering for me to attend? And I'm not, you know, asking for that to be addressed right now, but that was just a question that came up. And I think, you know, an issue just in general around these discussions of race. So I just wanted to say it. Thank you.
Oh, Jane, thank you so much for feeling comfortable sharing that pain. And I apologize for causing it. It is tricky. We had a presentation, a two-part presentation a couple of months ago by a white woman, who explicitly said this is for white people, and I'm not comfortable with that. What I was hoping to frame, and I really apologize if it came across in a way that was uncomfortable for you. I was just trying to frame my view. This is my experience. This is where I am on this path, and this is how I am trying to address it. And for me, the most important way I think I can address it is by trying to encourage other white people to get involved. It is, in a sense, a divisive way to have the conversation by speaking that way, but I don't have a different upaya yet. I'm hoping to find it. And I am so touched that you felt comfortable enough sharing that you were uncomfortable. That's a great gift. So I appreciate that. And if you have suggestions on how to better frame this for me, I would love to hear them. Maybe if you feel comfortable doing it, and we could connect separately. But to your other question, not that it's an answer necessarily to the concern about the plunge. The plunge has preponderance of the speakers are not white. It's being opened by a woman who is Indian American. There's a number of Black presenters. The middle of it, we will actually spend an hour and a half on the second day, the first half of the second day, where we will be witnessing with a beautiful group of people in Volusia, Florida, who will be honoring the lynching of a man down there under the auspices of Equal Justice Initiative. So it will be very different. It won't be a white bag of bones banging his gums, struggling to do the best he can and trying to walk through this difficult path. So I really, really appreciate you staying with us and not just dropping off at some point. And I really appreciate you sharing how it felt to you. And again, I apologize for that. And I'm looking for ways to do a better job.
Thank you, Jane, on behalf of the organization as well, for your honesty in sharing that. And Grant, thank you for your answer. So we are a little bit past time, so I will just say I appreciate everyone staying with this and contributing to a rich conversation. And we will close now. And hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon at another event.